March 1945, Germany. Something was disappearing from an American Army field kitchen. Not enough to trigger an immediate crisis. Not enough to stop the soldiers from eating, but enough to make the supply sergeant suspicious. Flour, potatoes, canned vegetables. Small quantities were disappearing at irregular intervals. For nearly 3 weeks, the supply sergeant, Harold Vance, checked the records. He checked the kitchen. He checked the storage area. Nothing explained the missing supplies. Eventually, he traced the discrepancy to one soldier, a 22-year-old cook named Private First Class James Morrow from Alabama. Vance asked him where the food was going. Morrow didn't hesitate. He told him the truth. The food was going to wounded German prisoners. About 400 yards from the American position was a holding area containing German POWs. Their normal supply system had broken. Down after a supply truck was destroyed in an artillery strike. The prisoners were supposed to receive regular rations. But for 3 weeks, they had been receiving less than half of what they were supposed to get. Morrow had noticed. And every other evening, he had quietly taken small amounts from his own kitchen and brought them to the prisoners. He hadn't asked permission. He hadn't told his commanding officer. He hadn't told the supply sergeant. He simply did it. For 3 weeks, then the missing food was discovered. The report moved up the chain of command, and eventually it reached General George S. Patton. Patton read the report. Then he put it down. He didn't immediately ask whether Morrow had violated regulations. He asked something else. Has anyone fixed the prisoner's supply problem? That question was about to expose a much bigger failure than one cook taking food without permission. James Morrow had grown up in rural Alabama. He was the youngest of 5 children. His father was a farmer who also cooked at church gatherings and community events. Morrow had learned to cook from him. By the time he joined the Army, feeding large groups of people was already second nature. He had been drafted in 1943. The Army quickly discovered that his cooking experience was useful. He became a military cook. By 1945, he had spent nearly 2 years working in field kitchens. He knew exactly how much food was required to feed a unit. He also knew how quickly a shortage could become a serious problem. 3 weeks before Sergeant Vance discovered the missing supplies, Morrow had been near the prisoner holding area. He noticed the ration distribution. The portions were small, too small. And then he noticed something else. Many of the prisoners were wounded. For wounded men, inadequate nutrition wasn't simply a matter of being hungry. It could affect recovery. It could make already serious injuries worse. Morrow went back to his kitchen. He began calculating. How much could he spare without leaving his own soldiers short? He couldn't take large amounts. He couldn't create an obvious shortage. So he took small quantities, flour, potatoes, vegetables, every other evening. Then he carried them to the holding area. He didn't make speeches. He didn't try to become friends with the prisoners. He simply delivered the food. From the prisoner's perspective, a young American soldier would sometimes appear. He would leave extra food, and then he would leave. They didn't know his name. They didn't know why he was doing it. They only knew that every few days something extra arrived. Meanwhile, the official supply problem remained unresolved. The supply truck had been destroyed. A replacement had not arrived. The administrative request was somewhere in the system, and 3 weeks passed. Then Sergeant Vance discovered the missing supplies. Now Morrow was potentially facing disciplinary action. The report described an unauthorized diversion of military property. But Patton noticed something the report had almost buried. The food wasn't being stolen for personal use. It was being used to keep wounded prisoners from going hungry. So Patton asked his aide to find out one thing. Had anyone repaired the supply chain yet? 2 calls were made. The answer came back. No, the prisoners were still receiving only about 40% of their normal ration. The request for a replacement supply arrangement was still waiting. That meant the problem had existed for 3 weeks, and the Army's administrative system had known about it. Nobody had fixed it. Morrow had. Patton immediately ordered the relevant supply section to restore the prisoners' food supply. He didn't want the problem routed through another slow chain of paperwork. The instruction was direct. Fix it, and fix it that day. Within hours, the supply chain was restored. The prisoners would receive their full standard ration again. But Patton wasn't finished. He picked up the original report. Now he wanted to know what would happen tomorrow. Had formal charges been filed? No. Had Morrow been placed under restriction? No, he was simply waiting to see what decision would be made. Patton's response was direct. No disciplinary action. The matter was to be considered closed. But then Patton did something even more interesting. He ordered an addition to the permanent record. The record would state that Morrow had independently identified a serious gap in the prisoner ration system. It would state that the responsible administrative section had failed to correct the problem for 3 weeks. And it would state that Morrow had addressed the problem, himself using the practical means available to him. Then Patton dictated one final assessment. Morrow had demonstrated the kind of practical judgment and personal initiative the Army expected from soldiers in the field. In other words, the cook had technically violated the normal supply procedure, but the system itself had failed first. Morrow saw a problem. He had the ability to help, and he acted. 3 days later, Morrow's commanding officer called him into a meeting. He told him the matter had been reviewed at a senior level. There would be no punishment. Morrow apparently didn't make much of it. He returned to the kitchen and went back to work. Sergeant Vance later said that this was one of the strangest parts of the entire incident. He had reported the missing food because it was his job. He had expected that someone would probably be punished. Instead, the soldier responsible was praised in the official record, and the administrative failure that had allowed the problem to continue was exposed. But Morrow himself apparently never saw the incident as extraordinary. When questioned about why he had done it, his explanation remained almost painfully simple. The prisoners weren't getting enough food. He had food. He could spare some. So he gave them some, that was all. The German prisoners eventually received their normal rations again. From their perspective, the situation was simple. For several weeks, their food had been insufficient. Then, every few evenings, a young American soldier had appeared with something extra, and eventually the normal supply returned. Most of them never learned who that soldier was. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his rank, and they didn't know that his actions had been discovered. Years later, accounts from former prisoners reportedly described a young American soldier who sometimes appeared near the holding area, left extra food, and disappeared without explanation. They remembered the food. They remembered the soldier, but they didn't know the story behind him. Morrow eventually returned to Alabama after the war. He spent decades working as a cook at a county hospital. He continued doing something remarkably similar to what he had done during the war, feeding people. He rarely talked publicly about the German prisoners. When his daughter eventually asked about the incident, his explanation was almost exactly the same. They needed food. He had food. So he gave them some. That was apparently how Morrow saw the entire situation. No hero speech, no claim of bravery, no attempt to make himself famous. Just a problem and a solution. And that may be what made Patton's decision so significant. Patton didn't simply ask whether Morrow had followed the rules. He asked whether the Army had done its job. The answer was uncomfortable. The prisoners were supposed to receive food. They weren't receiving it. The administrative system knew there was a problem. But 3 weeks passed without a solution. A 22-year-old cook noticed, and he quietly filled the gap. Morrow's actions didn't replace the system. They exposed its failure. And Patton understood that. He restored the official supply line. Then he made sure Morrow wasn't punished for trying to solve a problem. The James Morrow back inside the field kitchen after the investigation, calmly preparing food beside large steaming pots while other American soldiers work around him. His expression modest and focused rather than heroic. Sacks of flour, potatoes, canned goods, mess tins, and cooking equipment arranged throughout the tent. Sunlight entering through an opening in the canvas. Distant military vehicles visible outside. March 1945, Germany. Historically accurate U.S. Army field kitchen details. Candid black and white Wopbar-2 photojournalism. Realistic faces, grainy 35mm film, natural lighting, and restrained composition.